With its rapid growth and towering tassels, my garden wouldn't be complete without the glory of corn. As an urban gardener, I may have limited growing space, but planting corn from seed in raised beds can yield epic results. Better pollination occurs when planted in blocks, and with this method, I'm able to grow 48 plants in 32 square feet. Trench planting, seed spacing, and consistent moisture are key in this approach, and planting for the right time in your growing zone. All of this and more tips for growing king corn are coming your way. I'm Scott from New Garden Road, always out here to inform, inspire, and elevate you. Encouraging biodiversity and restoring habitat is my mission, one garden at a time. Why should you plant your corn in trenches? This can aid in their stability. If you get some strong winds or storms coming through as they grow taller, it will assure that they are more able to stay in place, hold their ground, keeping the corn plants from falling over, which could lead to them breaking or some other type of disruption or stress in their development. This will help to maintain upright growth, which is really important to me in a raised bed garden scenario. I've got some melons growing adjacent to this corn, and I want to be able to traverse the row, look for my melons, check on my plants, and if the corn goes a little bit sideways, starts to lean, then that can inhibit my ability to do so. And this would be really important for varieties of corn that get really tall. I've grown the Golden Bantam Improved historically. I really love that. It's a yellow sweet corn, and it easily gets to 8 to 9 feet tall. So you can see that it would be really susceptible to a storm rolling through. But there are other varieties to choose from out there. If you got one that's only going to get to about 4 to 6 feet tall, then it would be less likely to be bothered by some of these winds, and trenching might not be as important. However, I still think it's a good idea to do, and it's a fairly straightforward process, so let's get into it. All of my raised beds are outfitted with drip irrigation lines, and I've got the lines spaced 12 inches apart. Now, this is the perfect spacing for the trenches in my raised beds. But if we look at the seed spacing on a packet of corn, you may be seeing some confusing numbers on there. Number one, it will tell you to plant a corn seed every 4 inches and then to final plant spacing of 8 inches. And that's a really important number to focus on. You don't want to have your corn plants any closer than 8 inches apart. That's what they need to be able to grow and not compete with one another. But the other number that you will see on those packages of seeds is the row spacing, which is generally 36 to 48 inches or 3 to 4 feet. Now that's a lot of space in between rows. If I were to do that in my raised bed, I would really only be able to grow probably a third as much corn as I am right now. So essentially I can take that number for row spacing and throw it out the window. Why can I do that? Because I'm not growing a big field of corn, and it's less important that I assure that row spacing so that I can get through there and harvest and maintain my crops. Here I have designated pathways, I have multiple planting beds, and I already have that space allocated for being able to get all the way around my bed, and being that they're 4 feet wide, I can easily reach my hand through and get to the center of the bed from that spacing. I hope that lands with you. This is essentially about growing as much as you can in the space that you have. And in the end, none of these corn plants are any closer than 8 inches apart, which is the recommended final plant spacing. So going back to the drip irrigation lines that I have in my raised bed, essentially what I do is I utilize them to trace the pattern of the trenches before I start digging. And at that point, I found that I prefer to remove my irrigation grid because essentially it kind of gets in the way. And if you nudge it during the process, you can end up knocking some soil back into your trench. So it's a little bit counterproductive in that way. Honestly, what I have to do a lot of times is cover my planting bed with wire because I have some cats and other crazy critters around here that will come in, just romp through my plantings, mess up my trenches, and dig up my seeds. Now that I've got an idea of where I will be digging for these trenches, I'm going to need some tools. I like to utilize a sturdy garden rake. This can help to move soil broadly, but I might go for something like a standard hoe. This can move soil a little bit more efficiently for you. It just depends on what type of tools you have on hand. You can even use a hand cultivator or trowel or a small weeder. And sometimes I end up using all three of these types of tools as I really get into making those trenches the best that I can. The goal will be to have these trenches at least 6 inches deep. You want to have those side walls built up so they're going to be the opposite of the trench, and those are going to go in between the rows. And I generally start on one side by moving soil and I'll do that for all 4 of the rows in my raised bed, and then I'll go to the other side and do it again, and I kind of go back and forth and get them a little bit deeper in that way. Now, what I've learned over time is that it could be beneficial for me to actually remove some soil, and this can make it a bit easier to get those trenches in place. Even with this trenching method, I may have a few corn plants that get knocked over during the season, but I will stake them as needed. And while they can correct themselves and they'll start to grow upright again, they'll have this kind of curved form to them. If you stake them pretty quickly after they fall over, you shouldn't have any issues. You may need to be a little bit careful if they've gotten kind of big. Sometimes they'll snap on you, but this rarely happens to me, and I'll use some bamboo or a sturdy stake, and you can fasten it with some jute netting or even some of that stretchy green garden tie, which can be helpful as the plants continue to grow and it will stretch a bit. Another great benefit of this trenching method is that it helps to channel water towards the seeds to aid in germination. I really enjoy getting out in the garden and making several passes over these trenches. It's fairly meditative for me. I can watch that water sink in slowly as I pass each row. I'll go back and forth several times. And for me, I generally get my corn up in about 5 to 7 days with this method. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, planting your corn in blocks aids in pollination, making for fuller ears of corn. If you haven't grown corn before, what's going to happen is after a period of steady growth, they're going to get nice and tall and really big. You're going to have come up through the middle what's called a tassel. This is the pollen producing organ of the plant. Now that will come along first, and the next thing that you will see is the silks, and those are actually emerging for is what's soon to be your ear of corn. Each one of those teeny little silk threads is the potential corn kernel that you're going to be growing. So as that tassel grows nice and tall, it drops some pollen throughout the day, and those land on the silks, making your corn. So as you can imagine, if you have one row planted, being a wind-pollinated crop, some of that pollen is going to go to no use, but planting it in blocks or planting it in a field in a large mass is going to assure that all that pollen that gets whirled around by the wind is going to land on those silks and help to pollinate those corn kernels. Because of this, I like to grow an entire bed dedicated to producing corn. Now, there is a specific planting method called 3 Sisters, where you incorporate indigenous approaches utilizing corn and then planting beans, which will begin to grow up the corn, and then growing squash, which will grow out and cover and shade the soil as everything grows together. This is essentially companion planting. Why don't I do that in my raised bed garden? I did grow some corn and squash together one season, and it was a lot of fun to do because I just love growing these crops. However, it kind of goes back to my format in the garden, and the squash made it a little bit difficult to get to the corn plants when it was time to harvest. This year I did branch out a little bit because I'm crazy about growing beans. I wanted to grow as many varieties of beans as I possibly could. So I found a space alongside one of the long edges of this raised bed, and I planted some black beans. This is a bush type, so they should get enough of the morning and midday sun for adequate growth. They'll also be shielded from the southwest sun, which will be increasingly hot in my central Texas garden. But as they begin to bush out, they're going to kind of fall or spill outside of that bed, so they should have adequate spacing to grow and develop. Ultimately, it's just a personal preference whether or not you try interplanting or the 3 Sisters method. I think you should go for it. Follow your intuition, try some new things, and have fun. Now I want to get into more details around seed spacing for maximum production. Now if we go back to what it says on a package of seeds, plant every 4 inches and then thin to a final plant spacing of 8 inches, I just kind of think, you know, I'm conserving seed by planting according to the final plant spacing. I could plant every 4 inches, but then what if I end up with some plants that grow well that are 4 inches apart? I have to thin one of them out, right? Versus if I plant my seed accordingly, 8 inches apart, and I get some seeds that don't germinate, I can rapidly go in there and plant some more. I could start some backups in seed trays to fill in, and in the end, I have saved some seed and I've got my final plant spacing already there in place. In considering how much corn I can grow in my raised bed, I need to understand the square footage that's available. This is a 4-foot by 8-foot raised bed, and I have 4 8-foot rows. In each one of those 8-foot rows, I can end up with 12 corn plants spaced 8 inches apart. It's very important that I'm intentional about where I plant that first seed, as it will correspond to how much space I end up with at the end of the line so that I can get all 12 plants in. I like to incorporate some low-tech engineering into my garden, so what I got here is a 8-inch piece of bamboo. This corresponds to the final plant spacing for each of my plants, and what I like to do at the beginning of the row is I eyeball halfway through this 8-inch piece of bamboo, and I take that and I place it up against the inside of the short side of my raised bed. That means I'm 4 inches off the inside of the bed frame, and that's where I plant my first seed. This piece of bamboo is also really handy for making a small hole at the bottom of the trench where I can place my corn seed. And from there, I simply place one end of that bamboo stick right where I planted that seed, and I know at the end of it, I've got exactly 8 inches. And that's where I plant my next seed. Continue that process all the way to the end of the row, and after that, I should end up with the last seed being spaced about 4 inches from the end of the bed. Planting more than one seed in each space is sometimes what I do when the package of seeds is a little bit older. If you've got a fresh packet of seeds, you can probably just get away with planting one seed. If you do end up planting more than one seed in each space, and you get more than one to germinate, it's going to be important that you follow up with some thinning. You want to only have one plant growing every 8 inches, right? That's important so that they don't compete with one another. And generally, about 2 weeks after they germinate is when I would choose which one to thin out. Once your corn plants grow to a height of 10 to 12 inches, it's time to backfill those trenches. But first you want to take this opportunity to side dress with an organic, slow-release dry fertilizer. This time around, I've chosen the MicroLife Multi-Purpose. It's got an NPK ratio of 6:4, but it's got a whole lot more good stuff in it beyond those macronutrients. Once you've got that in place, you simply move the soil back up around the base of those corn plants. And if you've set some soil aside, now you can go ahead and add it back in. By filling in that trench, you're going to add about 6 inches of soil depth. That's really going to help them stand tall and be nice and sturdy. Now you can do this all in one row along the corn plants, or you can do like I did this time around, and I made kind of hills around the base of the corn plant. Intuitively, that just felt like the thing to do for me, and that ended up being, what I had to work with in terms of the available soil. And I've got to say, we've gone through some high winds, some storms, and I haven't had any of these corn plants move whatsoever. And since I initially removed the irrigation lines as I was building my trenches, this is when I put them back in place. After you've got those trenches filled, add a nice thick layer of mulch. You want to protect that soil. It's going to help retain moisture for your corn plants, discourage weeds, and it's going to add a layer to protect that soil microbiome, which is essential for healthy plant growth. Having consistent moisture will be really important for these corn plants as they grow and develop, especially once they begin to form those silks and the ears of corn are developing. That's when it really needs consistent moisture. And that's why I like drip irrigation or soaker hoses. I think they're easier to work with and you're going to get more efficient watering. You want that moisture to deeply penetrate the soil to a depth of 5 to 6 inches or more over a long period of time, and that moisture will be held underground, protected by the layer of mulch that you got in place, and the top layers of soil will dry out first. This will be good for the plant, and the roots, which have gone deeper into the soil because of that layer of moisture, will have access to it for an extended period of time. Planting at the right time is essential for growing most crops. And if you're gardening in an area with increasingly warm temperatures or extremes over the summer, this can be critical. Here in my Central Texas garden, we're in Zone 9A, and we can begin planting corn from seed in late February through the middle of April. We have to be ready to protect our corn if temperatures trend below 50 degrees for extended periods of time. Extended access to those lower temperatures at the beginning of the planting range could end up stunting your crops. If you are expecting a warm spring or a hot summer, it could be advantageous to choose a fast-producing corn, such as the Golden Bantam Improved. This one can mature in 70 to 85 days, and that's pretty quick. That means that your corn will more likely be ready for harvest before the extreme temperatures set in. This is important for two reasons, because once you hit 90 degrees, that's going to begin to stress your plants. This can also interfere with pollination. And the longer time frame you have above 90 degrees, the more stress and interference in pollination that will occur. And this can also correspond to more pest and wildlife pressure. As they get desperate out there, your corn looks really delicious, sweet, and full of moisture, and they will be more likely to check it out. If you've had problems with ants, corn earworms, or raccoons, try planting an early maturing variety early in your growing zone. In Central Texas, we have another planting window that begins in late July and runs through the middle of August for a fall harvest window. But if you live or have lived in Texas, you know exactly how hot it can be at that time of the year. That's when planting in seed trays or under shade cloth has advantages. I have a small pallet table in my garden where I start seeds throughout the year, and this can easily be covered with a couple of hoops, and I can put some shade cloth on it to protect my seedlings. Another way to do it would be to direct seed in a raised bed and make a simple low tunnel hoop structure that you could put your shade cloth on. Not only will this help your seedlings to be protected from harsh conditions during their tender growth, but it will also protect them a little bit from birds and scavenging critters. I think I'm going to take it from the top. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Trench planting, seed spacing, and consistent moisture is going to be I may be blah, 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 blah. Tall tassel. Well, that was painful. Now check out more awesome gardening videos on my channel. Like this video and follow New Garden Road for weekly content. You can grow your own food. Keep it organic.